Hello, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Daily Kos The Brief, our weekly show about politics. I'm Marcos Molitzis. I'm here with Carrie Alaveld, and today we have a show. We're going to actually have a great show. We're going to talk about the Supreme Court and what it means for not just for our rights. I mean, clearly abortion is on the firing line and in probably about to get overturned in or at least get knocked down to the state level, but also what kind of implications that might have for the 2022 midterm election. Today, our guest will be Brian Fallon. He is the executive director of Demand Justice. He was a guest back in March. So he sort of set the table of what the current Senate had to do on the issue of court reform. Of course, none of that happened, right? Because not much has happened in the Senate. But now we can wrap up the year, how the year turned, how much progress he's made in trying to convince the Democratic caucus that they need to focus on court reform. Before we get started on that, though, a couple of things. One is last week's episode on talking to people across the ideological divide was by far our most popular show ever. Carrie,
it was all soft news.
I don't know if it was soft news. I mean, clearly it wasn't directly focused on anything happening in the news cycle, but it's actually an issue that's very, very important. This is we are losing the messaging battle. We're not talking to people on, that are potentially persuadable. And a lot of us are actually having to deal with family members that are ideologically hostile in the holidays. Check it out. If you haven't heard it, seen it yet, definitely I recommend it. It was incredibly popular. Feedback on that show was pretty amazing. So, and one of our producers said it was her favorite show and the one that made her the most uncomfortable. Because It is like, I don't want to talk to Trump supporters.
I mean, just to be clear, right? Because a lot of the feedback before anyone watches it is like, tell me when Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to blah, blah, blah. And I'm just like, look, we're not talking about reaching out to Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? We're not talking about
no Nazis.
Yeah, right. No Nazis. We're not talking about finding common ground and building bridges to the Nazi side of the nation. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about like being able to have some conversations with people who are maybe a little on the fence. They like I was talking about, one dad that I know at my daughter's school where, he's kind of in that, well, the both sides kind of do it camp. Okay, well then, how do we draw that person out into a conversation that hopefully is a little illuminating over the course of time? That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about people who are like, yeah, white supremacy is the way, talk me down. We're not talking about that.
Yeah. So definitely I would highly recommend it. It got a better reaction than I even expected. So it struck a chord for sure. Carrie, in Congress this week, we've been the January 6th Commission had a meeting to basically vote to hold Mark Meadows in contempt. But in that meeting, Liz Cheney read a bunch of text messages from key Fox News personalities and some undisclosed Congress people
to Mark Meadows. Don Jr.
And Don Jr. And a couple things sort of have emerged from that. The first one's a point you made that it's actually an excellent point, that Liz Cheney, like, she's an evil genius and she is horrible. And I'm so glad she is on our side on this one issue, because there's not a single Democrat that would be managing this investigation and getting as much attention for it in the good way it has. There's no Democrat that could have pulled it off.
I got to tell you, it's so hard to say because her politics overall are abhorrent to me, right? Like, I just can't, I don't agree with her on a single thing, except that Donald Trump is largely responsible. He's not the only person responsible, but he's largely responsible for inspiring the January 6th attack on the Capitol that killed people, that injured tons, that caused trauma nationwide, as well as PTSD for a lot of those people. I agree with her on that. And she, on this commission, there is no doubt in my mind that if Democrats had been left to their own devices, and I'm not dissing Democrats overall, Democrats, I'm one of them, we do a lot of good, but she has a killer instinct that I think that Democrats wouldn't be wielding their power in the same way on that January 6th commission absent her. And she also, as you pointed out, brings, a lot of legitimacy to the commission, maybe not in the eyes of Trumpers, but in the eyes of a lot of Republicans. Dick Cheney was a hero. I don't know.
and as much as, you're right, we shouldn't so much dump on Democrats, for all the failings. I don't think the press lets Democrats be as aggressive as Liz Cheney is being. She's a Republican. She's given special treatment. They're allowed to be assholes. Like, Democrats are not allowed for whatever. I mean, we're seeing it right now every single day, the way they're talking about Joe Biden and continuing to both sides the Republican effort to destroy our democracy with our attempt to give people more health care and universal pre-K. I mean, it's patently absurd. But there's something about, like, if I was Bernie Thompson doing what Liz Cheney is doing, the press would be like, they would either ignore it, they would say it was a partisan, they would repeat Trumpian talking points that it's a partisan witch hunt. All those things. And for whatever reason, because Liz Cheney's a Republican, she gets to be that aggressive. And it makes me a little sad that we don't get to bottle that up and use it for ourselves all the time. Because it's really effective.
Yeah, what we need it on? We need to, if we could bottle that up and put that energy somewhere, I would put it all into next year on voting rights, personally. Like, getting something passed that helps insulate our democracy from what Republicans are trying to do across the nations in Republican controlled states. Like, I would harness whatever I could of her killer instinct and put it into that effort. And unfortunately, this is where her, sorry, I think I'm about to have an intruder. I think I should probably lock the door. Otherwise, hold on 1 second.
Yeah. So I will add that the other thing that has come out this week is just how real the Republican effort to overturn the election was. It wasn't some random protest that turned into a mob that stormed the Capitol. It wasn't just a random memo from some crank, law professor saying, oh, you can subvert the Constitution and declare that, Arizona and Georgia and Pennsylvania, Michigan votes don't matter. That was all. And you think, okay, these are happening sort of independently. Now you realize there was an actual serious, real effort. Mark Meadows had a PowerPoint presentation. He literally put this in a PowerPoint presentation, how we overturn our democracy. You might as well title it that. And just how close we were to actually having a serious constitutional crisis, if not the outright demise of our democracy. And I cannot believe it's not getting more, 24/7 coverage.
The media attention has been almost nothing. And I think that's part of what Liz Cheney is helping, right? She gets on, she during the committee meeting last night just starts reading the texts that were sent to Mark Meadows by these other people, and she reads them aloud. And of course, then the media has trouble ignoring them, right? But like, can I ask you a question? At what point did Mark Meadows realize that the materials he turned over to the committee were going to be a problem for him? That PowerPoint explaining how we overturned democracy, the text from Don Jr., who, Box of Rocks Don Jr. is like this among the sadist texts saying we need an Oval Office address. This has gone too far and gotten out of hand, and then you're like, at what point did Mark Meadows think, I don't know if this is going to be good for me and if Donald Trump is going to like this. Just tell me, do you know when? Because he was cooperating. He handed over all these materials that are now like, explosive materials. And then now he's like, okay, now I'm running back to my bunker.
I think I know when it was. It was when the excerpts of his book came out, and we found out that Donald Trump was COVID positive during that debate. And that's why he showed up late, refused to get tested, and all those things. And Trump got angry, and Meadows, who apparently is also dumb as a rock, you wouldn't think it. I mean, he doesn't seem dumb as a rock, realized, oh crap, maybe this book might not have been a great idea. And he was grilled over it in conservative media. And at that point, everybody said, oh, and he's also helping out the January 6th commission, and he had to back out. But at this point, do we even need his testimony? I mean, all his communications, the documents, the PowerPoint presentation, all those pieces that sort of paint a picture of what was happening in the White House, they're already out there. And Mark Meadows can't declare executive privilege because, one, he already released it, and two, the stuff that he has and he wrote about in his book. So he is kind of SOL, and I think it's freaking hilarious.
Let me make one very short point before we get to our guest, because I think he's about ready, it looks like.
Yeah, he is.
So I just want people to keep an eye on this, right? What we are watching now is, I'm sure, what the McConnell wing of the party hopes is a huge comeuppance for the Trump wing of the party. And just today, a couple hours ago, we saw Mitch McConnell, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, get asked if he had been one of the people who was in touch with Meadows during the January 6th attack on the Capitol. And he was all too glad to say, no, I wasn't. But it is going to be interesting. It is going to be interesting to see who is revealed, what is revealed in the, by the commission. So he like, with this like glum face, but inside he was doing a happy dance about that. Like he wants that commission to take down, like all of the idiots who are now running the House caucus, right? The House GOP caucus. I don't know if he has much love for Kevin McCarthy. I don't really know, but like Kevin McCarthy's just gone down that route, gone down that conspiracy rabbit hole. Yeah. And, there's some people in his own caucus who he wouldn't mind probably if they got in a little trouble. Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley. I mean, who knows? Mike Lee, like who, were these people in contact, So just watch, because the McConnell wing of the party wants the Trump wing of the party to get in trouble with this January 6th commission, and wouldn't mind at all if some of them got knocked off politically.
Yeah, I know. Absolutely. All right, Carrie, let's bring on our guest today. Our guest today is Brian Fallon. He is executive director of Demand Justice. He is a former press secretary for then candidate Hillary Clinton in 2016. Among, he was in the Senate. I think it was Harry Reid, right? In the Senate. So a veteran of Democratic politics and now focused on reforming the court. Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's always flattered to be on the program.
So, Brian, we last talked back in March, and at the time you made you said something along the lines of, I hope that Democrats in D.C. start treating court reform the way they're treating H.R. 1 voting reform. Now, 9 months later, it turns out that they didn't even treat H.R. 1 the way they should have treated H.R. 1 as an existential threat to our democracy. How about court reform? How's that been faring in Congress, in your opinion?
So it's making slow but steady progress. Not as fast as anybody would like, but we are making inroads. Just in the last year, we've had sort of two parallel tracks happening on this issue. One has been this court reform commission that President Biden set up. As you'll recall, in the final weeks of the 2020 campaign, when Amy Coney Barrett was confirmed, there was a huge uprising calling for court expansion. And Joe Biden tried to quell those calls by saying that he would appoint a commission that would take 180 days to study the issue. Those of us that have been advocating on this issue knew that that commission was a place to sort of stash this conversation and try to table it. So we never really viewed it as a venue where any progress was going to happen.
They weren't going to put you on that commission, were they?
I would have been flattered to be asked, but they weren't interested in having any outspoken advocates for any actual true reform proposals on the commission.
That was a lot more generous description than what Elie Mystal had when he came on, was talking about from The Nation. The Supreme Court reporter from The Nation he pretty harshly dissed that commission. Anyways, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I think the commission was co-chaired. The commission was co-chaired by Bob Bauer, who's a very well-regarded lawyer in Washington, former White House counsel under Barack Obama, and he's written about structural reform of the courts for years, and so I think he viewed this as sort of an intellectual feast. And so he surrounded himself with all these academics and constitutional lawyers. And it was like a faculty lounge discussion, and they ended up producing a glorified book report. So the commission has finally concluded its work this month. And the kindest thing to be said about it is that it's over, and that it has produced some people, quite surprisingly, it has produced some people who said that the process of considering these issues over the last 6 months have actually caused them to come out for adding seats. So Larry Tribe, a Harvard law professor, wrote an op-ed last week with Nancy Gertner, a former federal judge from Boston. Both of them served on the commission. Both of them said that they opposed adding seats at the outset of this process, but the consideration over the last 6 months has caused them to see this as the only option. I think there's going to be more people from the commission that come out in their individual capacities and say the same thing. But in any case, the commission's been happening. But while most of the media attention has been on that, there have been advocacy organizations like Demand Justice that have been working this issue to try to garner co-sponsors for legislation that's been introduced in both the House and the Senate called the Judiciary Act, which adds 4 seats to the Supreme Court. And we've made slow but steady progress. Pretty much every week, we're getting 2 or 3 new lawmakers signing on to the bill. Mondaire Jones, Hank Johnson, and Jerry Nadler are the main sponsors in the House. In the Senate, Ed Markey introduced the bill. And we've got about 50 co-sponsors now in the House. We've been organizing constituent meetings. It's a very laborious, time-intensive process.
Wait. 50, that includes Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema.
No, 50 in the House.
50 in the House of Representatives.
I almost got excited.
Yeah, we're a long way from having 50 in the Senate. We got about 25% of what we get in the House. Okay, so I said slow but steady, didn't I?
Right.
But a lot of big progressive organizations have also come out for it in recent months. SEIU just last month endorsed adding seats. They have a huge membership, obviously, but they have huge sway in Democratic politics. Whenever Democratic politicians are running in open primaries, the SEIU is an endorsement that's heavily courted. And I think that's a sign of what's to come from other big labor organizations. I think more repro organizations are getting into the game. And the Supreme Court term, unfortunately, this year, the cases that are on the docket, I think are going to produce just more of an outpouring of support for previously seen radical ideas like adding seats, just because in the absence of that, we have no good solution to this runaway 6-3 Supreme Court. So to answer your question, we're better. We're in a better place than we were when I last spoke to you, but we need to be making progress even faster. And I think come June, we'll probably see a quantum leap in the amount of support, unfortunately, because of rulings and cases like the ones that are coming up on abortion and guns and so many other issues.
Right. Let me just say it's really interesting to me to hear you say that SEIU has come out for it, because I feel like what you're talking about here is this like intellectual feast about the presidential commission. It's all this sort of high-minded, well, what would this back and forth sort of like tangential and intangible discussion, right? Well, when SEIU comes out for it, that changes who's having the conversation. You don't just have a bunch of intellectuals from Harvard wondering what this would do to the Supreme Court. You got boots on the ground, and that's just a totally different deal as far as I'm concerned. So that sounds great to me. I have to wonder. I see some of the, last week's oral arguments on the Mississippi abortion ban at the Supreme Court. I did see some stories, I think in particular in the Washington Post, about the notion that some senators were getting, more open to the idea of court reform potentially adding seats, maybe term limits, whatever. Have you seen a difference because of that that oral argument, which was kind of like off the rails?
Yeah, so that argument was definitely off the rails, and we started to see movement in September when the Supreme Court first let the Texas law stand. And so you have these two abortion cases that are before the court, this one in Texas and this one that they'll probably not decide until June, concerning the 15-week ban in Mississippi, which a lot of observers think is going to be the case that produces an outright overturning of Roe. But starting in September, when they first let the Texas law stand, while they continued to weigh the merits of the challenge to that law, you had Tina Smith, senator from Minnesota, who in a previous life, before she became an elected official, was a VP level senior official at Planned Parenthood, and so considers herself and is one of the foremost champions of reproductive rights in either chamber of Congress. And she had been somebody that prior to that ruling in September that let the Texas law stand had taken, some fairly bold positions, for instance, saying we should get rid of the filibuster in order to codify Roe v. Wade, but saw that we needed to go even further than that because this court is going to be hostile to even a, Women's Health Protection Act type statute that seeks to codify Roe. If this court is so hell-bent on, gutting the Roe precedent, the Casey precedent, what makes us think that they would show any respect for a congressionally passed statute that seeks to codify Roe at the federal level? They will gut that too. And so Tina Smith said, I got to go even further. If I'm going to be a true champion of reproductive rights, I need to not just support getting rid of the filibuster in order to try to enshrine Roe into law at the federal level, but I need to do something that frontally deals with the makeup of the court itself, because the court has become an existential threat to reproductive rights. And I think that when Tina Smith makes that decision, I think other, not just women senators, but all senators in the Democratic caucus that consider themselves champions of reproductive rights are going to have to undergo that same mental process and will arrive at the same conclusion. And it's just a matter, I think, of when, not if. I hope that more of them will conclude this before June when the Dobbs ruling comes out. But certainly by the time the Dobbs ruling comes out, I don't think that those people can go around and simply call for, hey, we need to pass a WIPA type statute. I think they're going to have a proposal to reform the court itself. And I think, Carrie, that mental process is going to take place across issues, because there's also a big gun safety case. And so Chris Murphy, who we all know as a big champion of gun safety measures, we don't need just background checks. We don't just need limits on assault weapons. We need a solution that deals with the court, because the court itself is an existential threat to common sense gun safety measures, and on, environmental issues. So I think that there's going to be a consensus. It's just a matter of, when, not if.
Can you just remind me, I'm sorry if you told us this, but how many senators do we have on board for some type of, serious court reform?
So there's just two sponsors of the Judiciary Act in the Senate. It is Markey and it is Tina Smith. Now you've had other senators, including in that Politico story that you referenced, express openness to the idea. And we've been in touch with one Senate office in the last week that I know is going to endorse the Judiciary Act in the coming days. So I do think that momentum is afoot. But, unfortunately, it's happening, a lot slower than we think it should happen. But if you look at this, court reform is a relatively new idea. Elie Mystal, who you referenced from The Nation, is one of the people that first put this idea out there on the table. And he was writing op-eds about this 3 or 4 years ago. And to go from, people like Elie writing about it to having a bill in Congress that has 50 co-sponsors in the House, that has the endorsement of SEIU, I think that this is moving rather fast by Washington standards, not as fast as we would like, but relatively quickly by Washington standards. I liken it to pretty much where we were on filibuster about 2 years ago. 2 years ago, Elizabeth Warren was talking about it in the Democratic presidential primary, but it did not have consensus support across the Democratic caucus. And now we're pretty much 2 votes shy of being able to change the rules. So I think that we're about, in that place where filibuster was 2 years ago.
So looking at the two abortion bills cases, one is Mississippi. That's a standard, I think 16 weeks or whatever, right? And that's probably gonna pass Supreme Court muster. The Texas one, though, has a sort of interesting wrinkle that I think has deeper consequences than just the issue of abortions, this idea that you can craft a state statute in a way that evades court supervision is not the word, scrutiny. And now you have Gavin Newsom in California saying like, all right, we're going to test the Supreme Court. We're going to do that with guns. We're going to give people a private right to sue gun owners, gun manufacturers. The law's not written yet. The bill's not written yet. So I don't know exactly what they're going to put in it. But the idea is sort of to like challenge the court. Now, a lot of us, do we really worry that this court's going to worry about being hypocritical? Of course not, right? I mean, they're going to find an excuse why it's okay to do that on abortion and not okay to do that with guns. But you have this idea endorsed by at least 4 justices on the court that you can write a law in a way that evades judicial scrutiny. 2, you had this other case, and the name escapes me at the moment, but could gut the ability of regulatory agencies in the federal government to promulgate rules based on legislation passed by Congress. It would basically say that unless Congress gives you explicit right to do something, you cannot do it. You basically have a court that is aiming to not just make the federal government ungovernable, but also allow states to pass laws that evade constitutional scrutiny. This is, Carrie, was it you who said this court is run amok? It does feel like this court is run amok.
I didn't say that, but I'll take credit. I like it, and I would like to associate myself with it. Anyway, go ahead.
Is that something that's sort of generating concern in the people you're talking to? Or are they more focused on sort of the big ticket abortion issue and guns? Because these may have even deeper consequences to our ability to run our government.
So this goes to an issue that Carrie hit on before. You know, whenever you're dealing with this issue of the courts and judicial reform, you're really sort of talking to 2 audiences. You have like these legal elites that obsess about the Supreme Court and, you know, very closely follow all of the machinations that are so opaque to the average member of the public. And they have very considered opinions about what should happen. And, you know, they largely think that ideas like expansion are too fringe. And in the Democratic Party, we tend to outsource what we think should happen on the courts to a lot of these legal elites and establishment thinkers that either, you know, litigate at white shoe law firms or serve in constitutional law professorships at big institutions like Harvard and Yale. So you have that audience. And then you have regular grassroots activists on the left that have, you know, very strongly held positions on issues like climate change and abortion, but always feel a little bit out of their depth and aren't quite sure if, you know, is the Supreme Court full of shit, or, you know, was there some reason that this case had to be decided this way? And we try to speak to both audiences at the same time. And what's happening, in answer to your question, is that the way that the Supreme Court is headed right now is convincing even the legal elites, the people that are most invested in preserving the status quo with respect to the Supreme Court. It's causing even them to step back and say, whoa, maybe these activists and advocacy organizations that are arguing for ideas like adding seats, maybe they're right, because at this point, even John Roberts is calling out his own colleagues in the conservative wing of the Supreme Court, telling them, you know, John Roberts said in his dissent in the Texas ruling that came out the other day, that it shouldn't matter what you think about the underlying statute. We as the Supreme Court have an interest in upholding the idea that these things have to undergo judicial review. Like, we shouldn't be complicit in allowing states or give states an incentive to craft statutes that are intended to evade, you know, any accountability. And he's alone on the right among the 6 conservative justices in thinking that. The rest of them are entirely outcome-based, are entirely ends justify the means. And so I love what Gavin Newsom is doing in California. And I think they should, you know, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Let's take that same legal theory and apply it to guns. Mark Elias has called for doing it with respect to voting rights. Hey, let's create a, you know, private right of action so that you could bring civil lawsuits about voter suppression and try to evade judicial review on that regard.
Oh my God, that is genius. Sorry.
But we should expect that the Supreme Court, because they're outcome oriented and because the ends justify the means, that they'll come up with some basis to say that, hey, our reasoning only applies to abortion. It doesn't apply to guns or voting rights. And so then we'll be still left with the question about what is to be done about the Supreme Court itself, and can we structurally reform it by adding seats, or are we going to continue to just try to come up with more novel legal theories as if we can litigate our way out of this problem? But like I said, I think more and more of the legal elite types are increasingly coming to the conclusion that these Supreme Court conservatives can't be reasoned with, and that it's time to entertain, previously ideas that were previously thought of as, radical, like adding seats.
Yeah. I was listening. I didn't listen to all the oral arguments on the Mississippi abortion ban, but I did listen to a couple podcasts about it with people who are much, much smarter than I am about abortion law and legal issues, et cetera. And they just said that, Chief Justice John Roberts just feels like he's antiquated at this point. He just just all of his right-wing, right-wing to me, but right-wing colleagues are like blowing past him as he's trying to say, hey, we could do something intermediate here, which would still be an affront to Roe, but would be, let's go to 15 weeks. And he's trying to offer this sort of moderate route, which frankly would probably be better for, I just don't think they seem to have any idea the extreme right on the court now. I don't think, which I count as at least 5 of the justices, maybe 6, but 5 of the justices, right? I just don't think they have any idea where how these things are going to play out politically. And it seems to me, maybe you can speak to this, maybe there's a silver lining in how radical they've become, how quickly, because when you get the boots on the ground plus the sort of elite class of thinkers and things like that headed the same direction, that's when you got a chance. And I think if they moved along the pace that Chief Justice Roberts was trying to go on abortion and other issues, then maybe you buy yourself a decade before, holy crap, the whole place is in shambles. I don't know if you can just weigh in.
You've put your thumb on absolutely the right dynamic that's going on here, because a lot of people, I think, mistake what's happening. They look at some writings of John Roberts and the fact that he sides with the liberals on some of these questions, and they say, oh, Roberts is trying to strike this moderate path. And to me, that's baloney. Roberts is not a moderate. Roberts is as conservative and wants America to look the same way that Alito wants it to look. Roberts just cares about the court's reputation a little bit more than Alito does. And so he wants to go slower. He still wants to get to the same destination. He'd still like to see Roe overturned. He'd just like to do it in multiple steps as opposed to doing it all at once, so that you can turn the temperature on the frog in the boiling pot up a little bit slower. But he still wants to boil the frog, just like Alito does. He would just do it in a little bit more clever, better disguised way. And so he's not ideologically moderate compared to his, colleagues like Alito and Clarence Thomas. He's just a little bit more mindful of how the politics plays. But some people try to act like, he's the centrist on the court, and he's not. The issue is, I don't know. I don't know. You said that they might not know how the politics plays. I think some of them might. I think Clarence Thomas and Sam Alito, I think guys like that, they have an own the libs mentality, which you wouldn't think that Supreme Court justices should have the same sort of approach to things as Tucker Carlson. And but I think they think about it in the same terms. I think that they think that they're in this existential struggle against, the left, and that they want to see people, upset. They like the idea that this will have a backlash, and they almost are so self-righteous about their own convictions that they won't be bothered by that. I
actually think that's true. I was thinking of someone like Amy Coney Barrett, newest justice, going to, joining Mitch McConnell on the stage in Kentucky to say, we're really high-minded thinkers and, adhering to the law and just interpreting the Constitution, and we're not politically motivated. It seems like Kavanaugh and Coney and Amy Coney Barrett are just sort of I don't know, out there in terms of.
Well, I think a lot of people were surprised by both Kavanaugh and Barrett in how outspoken they were during the oral arguments in the Dobbs case, where they basically showed their cards about their willingness to overturn Roe outright. You had Kavanaugh musing about the idea that it would be a neutral position for the court to take to let states decide whether to ban abortion or not. And you had Amy Coney Barrett sort of like, saying aloud that it wouldn't be an undue burden for women to have to carry babies to term because adoption's always an option. And I think people thought that there'd be a little bit more guile and that they would, maybe take the Roberts approach of trying to masquerade their position on this a little bit more. But I think what it revealed is that despite appearances like that speech that Amy Coney Barrett gave, at McConnell's Academic Center in Kentucky, that they're all in on this project, that they understand that, the reason that they are on the court and not other people is because they were viewed as sufficiently loyal to the mission that has been, a 40-year project of the hard right when it comes to, legal conservatives. And like we said before, it's been a combination of legal elites on the far right in the form of the Federalist Society, and then the foot soldiers at a grassroots level in the form of evangelical voters that care deeply about the abortion issue and Second Amendment folks that care deeply and vote on the gun issue. They've mobilized people in a mass way on those two issues, combining it with all these crazy cockamamie far right legal theories that have emanated out of the Federalist Society. And that's what we've got to match. We've got to get the so-called progressive legal elites in the academy and the folks that are on MSNBC all the time analyzing, legal developments, aligned with the SEIUs of the world and the MoveOns of the world. And I think we're getting there because all those groups, support, all those grassroots groups, all those advocacy groups support it, and more of those legal elites on the left are supporting it too.
So you talked about sort of this, things are going to be really upended next June when the court starts releasing these decisions, including final decisions. I actually wouldn't be surprised if Texas gets booted just because it's such the facts are just not very, what Gavin Newsom's doing in California. Like they may say, you know what, we're not going to open up that can of worms after all, when Mississippi is such a perfect vehicle to do what they want to do. And so that's going to happen. We're going to have a raft of decisions. It's going to create that impetus right before the election. Is there any chance that there may be any movement towards reform before the election? I mean, understanding that Manchin and the filibuster and Sinema, it's probably tough. Things are going to look tough for us electorally next year, just if history is any guide, and looking at Joe Biden's poor approval ratings right now. It's looking like a tough year. Is there any chance this happens without us winning bigger majorities in Congress, which is a really tough task?
So I think a group like mine is certainly working towards that goal. And every day we wake up trying to figure out how we can build more support more quickly for adding seats, because I am among those people that think that we're dealing with a finite window of time where we control the House, the Senate, and the White House and have the ability to pass things. And with all the gerrymandering that's happening, I worry post 2022 when the next time Democrats will be able to pass anything is. And so I do view this as sort of like an act now or miss your moment type window. So we are working every day to try to build support so that we could get this, at a consensus level of support in the Democratic Party in time to do something before 2022. But I'll be honest about where I think it sits right now. Where I think it sits right now, it's not caught up to all the other democracy preserving measures that do have consensus support and are just waiting for Sinema and Manchin to get in line before we can pass them. So, I wanted, when they reintroduced HR 1 at the beginning of Congress, I wanted some kind of court reform placeholder at least to be part of that omnibus, HR 1 bill. And the issue had just not ripened well enough for Pelosi and the House leadership to view that as belonging in the package. And I think that the next reasonable step that we should set for ourselves, those of us that are, part of this, doing this work, is to catch up so that we are in the same basket as filibuster reform, DC statehood, same-day voting, all these other issues that are further along in terms of politically ripening. Court expansion is still sort of being kept at arm's length, thanks in part to Joe Biden's commission. We do a lot of constituent meetings. And most of the time, if people don't, say yes. A lot of times people say yes to us because they just haven't had the issues surface to them. And when we confront them, they're members of the Progressive Caucus, they say sure, and they sign on to the bill. And we produce quite a few co-sponsorships that way. But a lot of times with Democratic members, the answer that we get is, well, I don't want to get out in front of the president's commission. So the commission has served to sort of give. It's sort of created political space for Biden to not have to take a position, but it's also caused a lot of members of Congress to be able to sort of like isolate the issue. And
that's why you're so excited it's done.
That's why
right.
Literally, now we're going back to all these offices and saying, all right, time's up. The commission's work is done. What do you think? Where are you on this?
And that's exactly why they do a commission like that. I mean, everybody who's been in Washington long enough, and it doesn't take more than like a few months, realizes that when there's a blue ribbon commission announced, that is a stall tactic. And it freezes the politics of it to some extent. But anyway, please
they didn't
go
even
ahead.
Disguise it well, to be honest, because they said at the beginning, oh, we don't want this to take any positions and make any recommendations. And then they put Federalist Society members on the commission. So it was sort of like doomed from the beginning. But it has served to allow members of Congress to punt. And now I would like to get it to the point where you can't be for filibuster elimination and not also be for this. You can't be for, DC statehood, voting rights, John Lewis. You can't be for all these other bills and then not have a plan to deal with the Supreme Court, because otherwise the Supreme Court will gut all those other ideas that you're going to pat yourself on the back for passing.
Yeah. Carrie, we have time for one more question, so I'll let you.
Well, I feel a burning question, which is, and it's not 100% directly related to your mission, but I do think it's very, very much a part of it, which is I'm sure taken in, a bunch of stories about how this Mississippi ruling is going to land. And it looks exceedingly clear that it's going to be at least a partial overturning of Roe, a gutting of Roe, if not a full overturning of Roe, right? So do you think people are overselling or underselling how that could shift the political landscape once that decision lands in June of next year?
So I think that it has the potential to really mobilize people in a way that the court has not succeeded in doing for decades. But I don't think it's inevitable. I think it has the potential because we poll voters on these issues all the time. For as long as we've existed, we're in the field quite often to test it. We mostly measure support for the court among Democrats and openness to ideas like adding seats among Democrats, because we're trying to mobilize Democrats on this issue. But we also test, all registered voters frequently. And even during the height of the Kavanaugh battle and the Amy Coney Barrett battle, people would tell us that they strongly supported the preservation of Roe and that they would strongly oppose any justice that would be open to overturning Roe. But then when you ask them straight up to predict, how fearful are you that Roe could be overturned? The same people that, have strong feelings about keeping Roe the law of the land would tell you that they don't think that there's a serious threat to it. They thought that it was a lot of crying wolf happening during all those confirmation fights. And so I think if the court actually acts in a way that truly explicitly overturns Roe, I think all that support that is right now below the surface but not really galvanized will finally galvanize. Like, I don't think it will just be Planned Parenthood activists out in the street. I think you'll have the potential for independents to be outraged because this is no longer, something that's going to just be felt in Texas or Mississippi. You have trigger laws in place, from centuries ago, where if Roe falls, it re-kicks in an abortion ban. And that's true in like a state like Wisconsin, a state that Joe Biden won. So that's suddenly going to be a relevant issue in a very purplish state. So I think that the potential is there for people to be animated. But I think whether that translates to anything real and any true change on this issue is going to be about whether we can get shows of political courage from elected Democrats to actually, respond in a proportionate way to an announcement like that. I don't think elected Democrats, can just come out in the aftermath of a ruling gutting Roe and say basically, please donate to the DSCC, help us win back the Senate, and
Yep.
yada, 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 we'll protect abortion rights.
What do you want to see immediately? What do you want? What do you want? You want an address from President Biden in the White House? What I
want to see. I think it would be good politics. There's a rich history in this country of presidents taking on runaway Supreme Courts that take unpopular stands on issues. Abraham Lincoln did it in the 1860s. Everybody invokes FDR and the court expansion plan that he floated that wasn't ultimately passed. But the campaign that he waged against the court did carry the day in terms of like public opinion. But even before him, Abraham Lincoln went to battle with the Supreme Court over, the conducting of the Civil War. Teddy Roosevelt, when he did his third party run, one of his big causes was taking on the corporate capture of the Supreme Court in that Lochner era in the early part of in that Gilded Age. And so there's a rich history of taking on the court for being captured by partisan or corporate interests. And I think if Joe Biden is, reacting to a ruling that guts Roe, if he's reacting to a ruling that says that, concealed carry permits have to be honored in Times Square in New York, Texans with concealed carry permits should be able to pack heat and walk in Times Square, and that the EPA is no longer able to regulate greenhouse gases. Those are all winning issues that he should, inveigh against the Supreme Court itself and wage a public. Joe Biden in general needs villains. He needs foils.
He needs villains.
And the Supreme Court will be a great one. And so I want him to take it on. I want him to ultimately support adding seats. But I want the statement he put out the other day in response to the Dobbs argument was milquetoast. It was blather.
Yeah.
And he was rightly criticized for it. I want to see him get animated and take on the court as an institution.
Brian, I know you have a hard stop, so very, very quickly, how can our listeners and viewers help you in your mission to expand the court?
A very straightforward way. So like I said before, we are organizing constituent meetings. They're all happening virtual now because most congressional offices are not taking in-person meetings. But it makes it actually easier for constituents to directly bring issues to their elected members of Congress, because you just have to hop on a Zoom and you can meet with the chief of staff. You can meet with the legislative director for these members of the House and members of the Senate. And so if you go to demandjustice.org and sign up with us, we will route you into a constituent meeting with your Democratic House member or your Democratic senator. And like I said, we've had over 90 of these meetings with over 1,300 people taking part in them. And we've had over a dozen instances where right after having the constituent meeting, we get the lawmakers signed on to the bill. So literally just participating in a 45-minute Zoom with your member of Congress could help us add another member that supports the Judiciary Act. So that's the most concrete way that people can get involved.
Holy shit, that's really cool. And I haven't seen anybody else do that. So kudos to you guys for maybe even pioneering that. Brian Fallon, Demand Justice, demandjustice.org. Thank you so very much for joining us. And hopefully we'll check in next year and maybe things will be moving even more. Thanks so much.
Thanks again for having me on, for continuing to spotlight this issue. It's really important that the progressive movement care about this.
Thank you.
Carrie, I love the idea of the Supreme Court as a villain. And I know I've been talking about Joe Biden needing a villain. And I don't know if Donald Trump really works as a villain in the midterm. He's the best villain for me, right? But they're not trying to get my vote, right? My vote's already happening. It's how do you motivate people who may not vote, or those college-educated suburban white women who, looks like they defected in Virginia and in New Jersey, and we need them back next year. Do you have any idea? And I know this is on the spot because it just sort of spurred my mind. What would be good villains for Joe Biden to
don't worry,
run
I have
against?
I have all the answers. So just sit back, grab your popcorn. No, I'm just kidding. I do think there's two sides to this equation, right? One is what Brian was talking about. We need the fight, right? We also need the villain, but we need the fight. We need to see this White House fighting for voting rights next year. We have to get out from under this Build Back Better. I don't know. Are we going to, pass it? Whatever. I am honestly, and this is going to sound
Joe Manchin as a villain is not a great villain for us.
No, not a great villain at all. And I honestly am ready to just see, I want Build Back Better so badly, but if it means another 2 or 3 months that get us into next year, that take away momentum from trying to get voting rights passed, et cetera, then we gotta fish or cut bait soon on that thing, really soon. like this month or next month, and that's it. So anyway, so we need the fight, because we need to see Democrats fighting for things. We need to see them fighting for voting rights. We need to see them fighting for abortion rights. We need to see them fighting for gun control. And we don't see enough of that fight. The Supreme Court is a great villain, but I think what it all fits under is the idea of extremism, that Republicans have gone down this extremist path, right? Almost every position they have right now is a, 1/3 to maybe tops 40% of voters believe in it. So you can say, we don't have to say, I mean, it's Trump extremism, but you don't have to try to apply Trump to everything. You pick whatever any candidate's Achilles heel is on the extremism, spectrum of things, right? Or array of things, being, abortion, guns, democracy, Supreme Court, etc. So I think that you can make all of these things fit under the umbrella of extremism. I oftentimes have started referring to the Supreme Court as the extreme court. I constantly talk about GOP extremism. The moderation in GOP land is gone. If you want, I think
they're literally all retiring. They're literally all retiring because they're
gone.
Excommunicated.
And if you look at people who you think might be the moderating forces, like McConnell, who is plenty on his own to destroy our democracy, right? But he's an establishment figure who, like, GOP donors think of as like the establishment guy. He's endorsing Herschel Walker. He's not going to put out an agenda, he's announced, for next year before next November. There's going to be no Senate GOP agenda. I mean, then you look at McCarthy. McCarthy's handed over his entire caucus to Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boebert or whatever, however you say her name. And then you look at Chief Justice John Roberts on the court. He's trying to moderate how fast they get to an extremist end. Well, you know what? He practically seemed irrelevant during those abortion arguments last week. So if you look at sort of the entirety of the Republican Party, anyone who was supposed to be, I mean, look at Fox News, Chris Wallace, who was the only guy who used to ask any reasonable questions or any hard questions of any political figures, Republican political figures. He just left Fox News because Tucker Carlson has gone down the white supremacy and, great replacement theory route.
And he's going to be on some like online streaming thing. He's not even going to an equally prestigious, elevated job. I mean, it's very clear he was shoved out the door in some way.
He's shoved out the door, or just no longer could look at himself in the mirror anymore. And you know what? Frankly, congrats to him if you can no longer look in the mirror because you think, Fox News has become too much of a cesspool to stay there. So I guess to answer your question, I think that you don't have to point to Trump. I think you can point to Trump extremism all over the place. And you can say, look at how extreme the Supreme Court has gotten. Look at how extreme House Republicans have gotten. Look at how extreme the Senate GOP candidates are. Look at, and you fit all of these different issues under the umbrella of extremism. And you fight like hell against the extremism that is the Republican Party. And you can do it on multiple fronts. But we gotta have that fight, man. We gotta convince. I mean, let me just say one other thing. I know, I just keep talking, but let me say one other thing. I was listening to Cornell Belcher on Pod Save America, and he made the point that, in terms of polling, he was
Who is he?
Cornell Belcher is a Democratic pollster who polled for Obama, the Obama White House, etc. I know you know who he is. Anyway, but yeah, for our listeners. And he was saying, look, Biden's approval ratings are the way they are because he's had a double-digit drop among Democrats, not independents. I mean, he's had like a 10. I was looking at Civics, right? Our polling outfit. And he's down like 13 or 14 points since passage of the American Rescue Plan, with Democratic voters. He's down like 10 points with independents since passage of the American Rescue Plan.
And they're probably left-leaning independents too.
Left-leaning independents, right?
Yeah.
So we are losing. It's not like we've lost Republicans, like
they
we
were never
shaved
there.
off like 3 points. They were never there.
Yeah.
So we're losing our own people. Cornell Belcher said, he is below 70% in his polling with African Americans. So a job approval rating for Biden. He said, Barack Obama was never below 70% with African Americans. I mean, that is the freaking bread and butter. That is the backbone of the Democratic Party. So if we're not winning those folks, if we're not winning people who want to like us and who voted for us, if we're not winning those folks, we are doing something extraordinarily wrong. And they need to see a fight, I think. They need to see the fight.
Yeah, and it's not a press release or a tweet. Like, actually doing the hard work of governing, even if you lose, like, show the fight. I mean, if Manchin and Sinema stand in the way, so be it. But at least you fought and you said, it's not the Democratic Party, it's these two assholes. Help us win more. It's a tough year. I mean, things are, it's nobody's going to sugarcoat it here. Like, we're realists. But yeah, fight means more than just say a couple words or one speech. It actually means on the ground work to get people mobilized. I mean, we know Trump did it. Look, I mean, he did a whole coup. He got people to storm the freaking Capitol. That's what we're not asking for people to break the law and mount an insurrection. We want to use lawful means because we are law-abiding lovers of democracy. So, hey, Carrie, we got a couple of minutes. This is our last live broadcast of the year. I think we may do a rebroadcast next week. But so I just want to take a moment, and I'll give you the chance to. I just want to show a lot of gratitude for everybody that has had such an amazing impact on my life this year. My family, my coworkers, everybody at Daily Kos, listeners and readers. I love you all so much. We're in this existential fight for our democracy, and I couldn't think of better people to have by my side than all of you. I'm grateful I have a wonderful partner. I have wonderful kids. My son went to basic training this year. He's in the California National Guard. My daughter is a freshman in high school, and she just got promoted to the varsity debate team just a month after she joined the debate club. I mean, she's
impressive. That's impressive.
She's going to be a great, I'm like, oh no, she's going to argue for practice. I mean, she's a teenager at home, a 15-year-old, like, more arguing, but she's an amazing.
I can't believe you produced someone who's going to argue for things.
Oh my God. Who would have predicted that? And so I'm just surrounded by these amazing, my friends, just by this amazing community. I'm so incredibly grateful for everything I have, and I don't take that for granted. And so I want to wish everybody a wonderful holiday season, a new year, and really hoping that 2022 is an upgrade from these pandemic years we've just 2020 and 2021. But I love everybody, and so grateful to be able to do what I do, and I do it because of you guys. Carrie, your turn.
Oh boy. Well, this is spontaneous, but I mean, I am super grateful for all of the all of the good fortune I have in my life, health, family, friends who I would love to see more. The pandemic's been terrible in terms of that, but community, the Daily Kos readers, we go back and forth in those comments, but I appreciate everyone who reads our stuff, who takes it seriously, who engages, who brings their own ideas to the table, the news that they've been following, etc. It's really an extraordinary community. I want to say too, you thank me almost every episode for being a great co-host, and I just want to say thank you for inviting me to do this, because this was your show and you invited me to do this, and otherwise I'm just like, I'm just yelling things from the cheap seats. So anyway, so I appreciate that. Thank you, Marcos. I also want to give a shout out to Dorothy Heath. Dorothy writes up these, every after every episode, almost every episode, she does a write up of our show. So I appreciate that. We always usually thank the producer, and we thank Kara, and we thank Carolyn. But I wanted to just give a shout out to Dorothy for the work that she's been doing. And I just want to say to our listeners, our viewers, our readers, like, don't give up hope. I know these are tough times. These are very tough times. They are sometimes financially tough. They are sometimes really tough with our family, the disconnectedness. I think one of the reasons that our last episode hit so well is because people feel disconnected. And I think, the idea of trying to figure out how to connect better, how to connect more, is so important for us as, as human beings, as a humanity, and particularly in this moment as a democracy. So, don't lose hope. Reach out to the people that you need to reach out to. Try to build bridges where you can, within the boundaries of what's safe and mentally good and healthy for you, emotionally healthy for you. And we appreciate everything that you have brought to the table here at Daily Kos and that you are doing in your daily lives. So take care of yourselves. Happy holidays, everybody. Stay safe. Be joyous. Knock back a drink if that's your thing. Otherwise, just have some good food. But yeah.
That's our show for today. Thank you, Carrie. That was lovely. Thanks to the entire Brief team, Walter, Kara, Carolyn, Dorothy. And thank you, the viewer, the listener, the reader, for everything you do, for the activism and passion and energy you bring to this fight and to this movement. Love and appreciate all of you. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful year, and see you in the new year. Bye-bye.